Hi, everybody. Today we are looking at the theme of a story. We're going to look at what theme is and talk about how to find it. Now, many of you have learned a little about this in the past, and you've learned that the theme is the message of a story. And that's a good way to remember it quickly and to kind of summarize it. But we're going to get a little bit deeper than that. The theme is the message, but specifically, it's a lesson about humankind, or what we call the human condition. So it has to do with real world experiences. It does send a message to the reader, and that message is told through the characters and the plot. So you have the plot of the story, like the tip of an iceberg, but underneath that, where you can't really see it because it's not exactly spelled out, that's where you find the theme. The theme is a message or a lesson that you have to derive from the story. The difference between plot and theme is fairly simple. The plot is what happens, but the theme is the bigger overarching idea about what happens. So it's almost like what happens in the story is representative of a much larger idea, and that idea can be your theme. So, for example, in a short story, a boy, Zach, learns that he's moving to a new apartment. He's worried about missing his friends. That's what happens. But the big idea about that might be the idea that change can be difficult. Notice it's not just about moving, it's not just about Zach, it's not just about losing friends. It's a much bigger idea that applies to the human condition. We all know that change can be difficult. It turns out that Zach is just moving to a new apartment in the same building, so he's relieved in the end. Well, that's what happens in this story, but in the real world, maybe that transfers to the idea that sometimes we worry when we jump to conclusions too quickly. So notice that the theme never is specifically about the characters in one story or what actually happens in one story. It's always about a much more abstract idea that plot fits into. Finding the theme can be done in a couple of ways. So you're getting some clues to the theme through your main conflict and through your main characters. Your main conflict is your problem, or what is the main interaction that needs to be solved. And your characters, you might look at what your character wishes were different, what the character learns, or what he or she does to change. For example, when we read A Christmas Carol, the main conflict is that Scrooge is unknowingly heading toward an eternity of suffering due to his selfishness. It's eventually resolved by the spirits visiting him and changing his perspective. So now I look at my main character, Ebenezer Scrooge. What does the character wish were different? Well, eventually he finally realizes his fate and he wants to change that. He wishes that were different. What does that character learn? Well, Scrooge changes his behavior. He becomes generous and magnanimous and kind to others. So we can look at those lessons and we can see what the character learned. The way that the character changes and what they end up like in the end typically points to what the author is trying to teach us. So let's look at the fun they had. This is the story that you read this week. It's a little bit more difficult because it's not as packed with action. It doesn't follow as clear-cut a plot pattern. But the main conflict is essentially that Margie doesn't like school. How is it eventually resolved? Well, in the end of the story, she learns about how school was in the past and she longs for it. She imagines how fun it would be to be in the type of school that they had in the past. And of course, that really means like we had. So, what does she, the main character, Margie, wish were different? She wishes that her school were different. And she learns that people must have had fun in the past when school was in person. Well, when we look at that character change, that shows us the theme. The character often realizes the lesson that the author is trying to show us.